as you have in India, there was a picture of a very famous movie star, not a picture, a
Poster.
poster,
Yeah.
very famous movie star, and I said, oh, she's very beautiful, and she said, she's not beautiful, she's beauty itself. When I first went to New Delhi, and the layers of the culture were so apparent in the first night we were there.
You know, the most fascinating thing about 3,000 Years of Longing is how difficult it is to define it.
Good.
Because, it's a romance, it's an epic, it's a fantasy, it's also a story about the power of stories. Is that what drew you into it?
Oh yes, definitely. In those few sentences you've described it all. You should be sitting here and no, that's exactly what drew me into it. It was very rich, and if there's a little detector like a Geiger counter that detects really rich theme to mine, that was all there in that story. And because it's a relatively short film, it's about 100 minutes long, but it just was able to deal with all those things in one story. It was an allegory, and that's always a more efficient way of getting a lot of that stuff across. So.
You know, in a film like this, where visually you can go anywhere because it is a fantasy, how do you resist making technology a crutch?
In which way? You mean
because it's a fantasy,
okay.
almost anything is possible.
Yeah, so it can become overly extravagant.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
or sort of a substitute for storytelling.
Yes. Oh, that's a great question. It really is. Okay. The first thing you have to do is to decide what are the organizing principles of how you tell the story, how you deal with each world, at every level of design, for instance. So, for instance, the deeper you go into the past, the more fantastical it becomes. For instance, when you go into the 3,000 years before the time of Sheba, there's no historical record. I mean, Sheba, there's several theories about where she might have come from, and whether you're in Ethiopia or Yemen or other places, you've got different versions of Sheba. In the city where I live, in Sydney, there's a big painting, 19th century painting of Sheba going to visit Solomon. And it's done in the style of the Orientalist style that they did at that time, and yet in this story, the jinn insists that Solomon came to visit her, and she says, "But wasn't it? People wrote music about it, so it's all in the holy books." And he said, "I was there." So
one of my favorite moments in the movie.
So we now have creatures which are, there's one creature who's a giraffe. He's a giraffe with the stripes of a zebra, and yet then we jump, 2,000 years later, basically at the time of the Ottoman sultans, and we spend about 100 years there, and the fantastical qualities are far less. There's one creature that the jinn calls the Ifrit, and they're very brief. And then we go to the 19th century with Zafir, and what is fantastical or is in the imagination and expressed through mathematics, and then we end up in the modern day. So those sort of strategies really have got to influence how it looks. It gives you the discipline for it. And where I learnt that the most, we'll take a bit of extra time for this interview, when I first went to India. When I first went to New Delhi, and the layers of the culture were so apparent in the first night we were there. There were people in modern dress. There were people in variations of that. There seemed to be modern buildings, and there were sort of ruins. I don't know exactly what they were. That seemed to be very old. And everything in between. And the palimpsest, if that's the word, was so layered. And it was the first city I've ever been in where I was completely disoriented as a human being until I started to read. And there was a book called The City of Jinns. Do you know it? And,
Yes.
And which that's explained, where he wrote about what it was to live in modern day New Delhi, and then told the stories, I think, from Indira Gandhi's assassination way back into the deep mythological past, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And suddenly it made sense. And that was a big influence on this film, believe it or not.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, because that's who, and interestingly enough, when we go back into the past, it becomes, we have license to tell stories in a much more flamboyant way than you normally would. When we come into the real world, or in the world that we feel in the present world, of course you can intrude fantasy into it, but it still has to be based in the reality, the ever-changing reality of the real world. That's one of the things, one of the, if you like, rules of telling this story we had to adhere to. So, when Alethea goes into a modern airport, it's got all the technology. When the jinn goes into that world, he's bombarded by the electromagnetic forces, which are always present in the universe, but we harness them since Maxwell and Einstein. We can harness that stuff, and we can turn it into the stuff, into this stuff that gets broadcasted around the world. So that's the way you try to discipline the story, and I hope if we've done that, okay, that the story that will be apparent to an audience. I've never been asked anything like that before, but it's what's happened. It's the way we approached it anyway.
Thank you. That was lovely. And come back to India. It would be an honor to have you.
Where are you from?
I'm from Mumbai.
Mumbai.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. I'll never forget that. There's a line in the movie which happened when we were there with a man who was guiding us around, and as you have in India, there was a picture of a very famous movie star, not a picture, a
Poster. Yeah.
Very famous movie star, and I said, oh, she's very beautiful, and she said, she's not beautiful, she's beauty itself. And that's what the jinn says in the movie.
That's right.
Yeah, that happened there.
How lovely.
Yeah.
How lovely. Well,
So,
I will take that back with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.